Investigators conceded that actionable intelligence was scarce. Even with the family's recent $1 million reward offer, a surge of law enforcement descended upon a property. A sudden and decisive action that shattered a prolonged period of investigative stillness. Nancy Guthrie had vanished, and with each passing moment, the hope of finding her alive diminished. The FBI then brought Tomaso Shion into an interrogation room for what would become a marathon session. The unsettling part was his initial demeanor, that of a worried relative. There was, however, a glaring inconsistency. The forensic evidence failed to corroborate his display of grief. In the early hours of Monday, February 1st, just after midnight, a masked and armed figure approached Nancy's door. With his head lowered, the individual fixated on the home's doorbell camera before turning to hastily gather foliage in a crude effort to obscure the lens. Ultimately, under the crushing weight of the inquiry, the facade crumbled and the truth emerged. That confession, now a matter of public record, detailed a sequence of events so disturbing it evokes a profound sense of dread, the kind of truth that only surfaces in the cold confines of an interrogation room. For years, federal agents meticulously tracked the movements of every person of interest connected to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. For an extended period, the investigation had been stagnant, a vacuum filled only by rumor and speculation. Updates were virtually non-existent. The mother of Today's Show co-host Savannah Guthrie, she remained missing after her abduction from her Tucson home over the weekend. That all changed when investigators finally seated Tomaso Shion in an interrogation room measuring a spare 10 feet by 12 feet, approximately 3 meters by 3.5 meters. From the outset, the room was charged with a palpable tension as agents initiated a slow, deliberate game of psychological chess. They were convinced that Tomaso, the son-in-law, possessed the information needed to unlock the case. The challenge was compelling him to divulge it. The Bureau had been methodically compiling data for months, analyzing a digital trail of cell phone pings and credit card transactions. This data revealed that on the day Nancy vanished, Tomaso's phone had traveled nearly 15 miles, or 24 kilometers, from his residence. This was a critical piece of evidence, as it directly contradicted his initial statement to local police that he had remained at home all afternoon. When confronted with this discrepancy, Tomaso's complexion paled, and his hands began to nervously adjust the collar of his shirt. But his composure did not shatter immediately. The process would be far more complex. He attempted to explain the trip as a simple drive to clear his mind, an explanation the agents found implausible. They intensified their pressure, presenting him with photographs of the exact location his phone had registered. The images depicted a remote, wooded area near a lake, isolated from any major thoroughfares. Crucially, investigators at the scene had discovered tire tracks that were a perfect match to his vehicle. Perspiration began to bead on Tomaso's forehead, despite the room being kept at a cool 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. He was ensnared in a lie, a realization that was dawning on him with devastating clarity. For more than 6 hours, the interrogation continued relentlessly, with agents affording him no respite. Their strategy involved waiting for a critical error while discussing Nancy in the present tense, as if she were still alive. They would pose questions about what she might think of his current situation. This application of psychological pressure, a classic investigative technique, proved exceptionally effective. As the persona of the concerned son-in-law disintegrated, Tomaso's voice began to fracture under the strain. The collapse came sooner than anyone had anticipated. The sheer weight of the evidence proved to be an unbearable burden. What was not immediately apparent was that the FBI held even more incriminating evidence in reserve, cards they had not yet played. The pressure inside the room was escalating to a critical point, and to the observers behind the one-way glass, it was clear a breaking point was imminent. Tomaso requested a glass of water, but his hand trembled so violently that he spilled half of its contents onto the table. His gaze shifted from the camera in the corner of the room back to the agents, a silent acknowledgement that the secret he harbored was consuming him. Was the truth about Nancy's fate contained within the very words he was on the verge of speaking? The day Nancy Guthrie disappeared began as an ordinary Friday. She had arranged to meet friends for lunch, an appointment she would never keep. As hours passed, repeated attempts by her family to contact her were met with the cold finality of her voicemail. By 8 o'clock that evening, a growing concern had metastasized into outright panic. The narrative becomes complicated here, as Tomaso was the last known person to have seen her alive at her residence. He claimed she was in good spirits, and had only mentioned leaving to run errands. However, there was a significant problem with his story. Her vehicle remained in the driveway, and her purse was found resting on the kitchen counter. It is highly unusual for a person to voluntarily walk away from their life without their keys and financial means. Initially, local police handled it as a standard missing person case, but the investigation was escalated to the FBI upon the discovery of signs of a struggle in the hallway. Scuff marks scarred the floor, physical evidence suggesting someone had been dragged nearly 6 feet or 2 meters toward the rear exit. Tomaso attempted to dismiss the marks, attributing them to his having moved furniture earlier in the week. He seemed to have a ready explanation for every inconsistency, yet none of his answers withstood scrutiny. A neighbor's report of a loud thud around 2 in the afternoon directly contradicted Tomaso's claim that he had been napping at that precise time. With only 50 feet, or 15 meters, separating the houses, sound had a way of bleeding through the oppressive silence of the neighborhood. At 2:30, a delivery driver registered Tomaso's car pulling away from the residence, moving well above the 25-mile-per-hour, 40-kilometer-per-hour speed limit, an observation suggesting a man fleeing something. What most observers couldn't comprehend was how these minute, seemingly trivial details were becoming the psychological scaffolding for the FBI's interrogation. They were methodically constructing a profile of a man engaged in a frantic campaign to erase his own actions. The objective was clear. The agents operated under a single, powerful theory. If they could fracture his timeline, the rest of his story would collapse, exposing his involvement. For hours, they fixated on the same 10-minute window of time, compelling him to reconstruct every single second of his day. The pressure began to wear on Tomaso. His frustration mounted, and his narratives became more elaborate, each revision less tethered to reality. He was, without question, the focal point of all suspicion in the room, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing him. Meanwhile, theories circulated, but one grim certainty was taking hold. NY's disappearance was not accidental. The immense pressure within the interrogation room was a microcosm of the tension that had seized the entire town. The community was starved for answers, and their patience had worn thin. The FBI was resolute in its mission to penetrate the heart of what transpired that Friday afternoon, however long the process might take. Was there a hidden witness? Someone lurking in the shadows that Tomaso had failed to consider? The room was thick with unspoken horror. When his confession finally came, it wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet, broken whisper. He leaned forward, cradling his head in his hands, and admitted that events had spun tragically out of his control. He spoke of a confrontation with Nancy, an argument centered on finances and long-held family secrets. In that instant, the disturbing nature of the case file became a tangible, horrifying reality. He detailed a scenario where his own fury had taken command, driving him to an act that could never be reversed. He avoided the specific word, but he made it abundantly clear that Nancy had lost her life in that house. The truly chilling aspect, however, was his description of the aftermath. He claimed a wave of panic drove him to spend the subsequent 3 hours systematically scrubbing the house with industrial-strength chemicals. He had emptied nearly 2 gallons, 7.5 liters, of bleach in a desperate bid to chemically erase any evidence of what had taken place. This detail was pivotal, as the FBI search had already uncovered trace elements of those very same chemicals. Though the house appeared spotless, his efforts had not stopped at cleaning. He confessed to transporting her body to a location almost 20 miles or 32 kilometers away. The spot he had chosen was so profoundly remote, he was certain no one would ever find her there. He recounted the long drive in the deep of night, how he had stuck to back roads to evade the omnipresent gaze of traffic cameras. Even within his panicked state, a chilling level of calculation was at work, a detail that deeply unsettled the agents listening to his account. What remained unknown until that point was that he had secretly returned to the location 2 days later, compelled to confirm that his secrets were still buried. He was obsessed with not being caught. It wasn't that simple, however, as his own mind was beginning to betray him. He admitted to the agents that he was haunted by the image of NY's face, an apparition that appeared every time he closed his eyes. This haunting was not necessarily born of remorse, but of a profound terror of the consequences. He had become a hollowed-out man, driven by the sheer weight of his actions. The agents sat in stoic silence as he meticulously described the geography of the burial site, finally marking a precise X on the map they had provided. He offered them specific landmarks, a particular oak tree and a line of rusted fence that ran for about 100 yards or 91 meters. Would the physical reality of the site align with the horrors he had just confessed? Following the map Tomaso provided, a team of over 30 investigators advanced into the woods at dawn, facing a difficult hike of nearly 2 miles or 3 kilometers through thick brush and treacherous, uneven ground. The air itself felt damp and heavy, mirroring the grim purpose of the search party. As a first measure, they employed ground-penetrating radar to search for any man-made disturbances in the earth. They were hunting for anything that seemed out of place in the natural landscape. After 4 methodical hours of scanning, the radar detected something significant. The anomaly was located approximately 3 feet or 1 meter beneath the surface. It was precisely where Tomaso had indicated it would be. With the surgical precision of archaeologists, the team commenced the slow and deliberate process of recovery. They soon uncovered items confirmed to belong to Nancy, which included a piece of jewelry she was known to wear every day. This discovery marked the investigation's shift from a missing person case to a recovery mission. It also became apparent that Tomaso had tried to inter other evidence with her, perhaps believing it would all decompose into obscurity together. Investigators unearthed a pair of work gloves and a small shovel, the handle of which contained his DNA. This finding was consistent with a pair of gloves that had been discovered about a mile from the Guthrie home. They appeared to be the same type seen in a neighbor's doorbell video. Investigators were already fast-tracking the items for DNA analysis. It was a veritable mountain of forensic evidence that made any credible defense virtually impossible. The FBI, without a doubt, had constructed an unassailable case. While the recovery team was deep in the woods, Tomaso was being formally processed back at the station. He had retreated into a complete and total silence, finally comprehending the immense gravity of what he had confessed. It appeared any lingering hope that his confession might afford him some measure of mercy had been extinguished. Yet, the brutal nature of the crime made any other explanation seem improbable. A current of disbelief and horror moved through the community as word of the grim discovery began to spread. Nancy was a cherished grandmother and a pillar of the community. The concept that her own son-in-law was capable of such an act was a reality too monstrous for many to process. The recovery effort spanned nearly 12 hours, a meticulous operation dictated by the need to document every single piece of potential evidence. Forensic teams confirmed that the ground in the area had been recently disturbed, lending a chilling credence to Tomaso's account of returning to the site. Everything he had confessed within the stark confines of that interrogation room was proving to be a disturbing, unshakable truth. A persistent question haunted investigators. Is it conceivable that Tomaso had an accomplice during those desolate, late-night hours? In the final analysis, the interrogation recordings, supplied by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, became the irrefutable evidence that dismantled Tomaso Shion's defense. He was formally charged with a slate of felonies, which included the act of taking a life and the deliberate tampering with evidence. The trial itself was brief, a direct result of the overwhelming and conclusive nature of the evidence presented against him. No one, at the outset of the search, could have predicted this outcome. But the truth possesses an unyielding way of forcing itself into the light. Even with the guilty verdict, the family is left grappling with a void that can never be filled. They must now exist with the harrowing knowledge that the individual they had embraced as their own was the architect of their deepest pain. There is no simple path to moving beyond a trauma of this magnitude. The Guthrie family has since requested privacy as they attempt to navigate the contours of their new, fractured reality. What remains largely unacknowledged is the profound and lasting impact this case had on the operational procedures of local law enforcement in disappearance cases. They now operate with heightened urgency within the first 48 hours, keenly aware of how rapidly a crucial trail can grow cold. Nancy's legacy, in a tragic irony, is now inextricably bound to this evolution in how justice is pursued for the missing. Speculation and rumor regarding Tomaso's motives still linger, but they are mere shadows circling a solid core of fact. He made a decision that resulted in the destruction of multiple lives. The Bureau's release of the audio tapes was a calculated measure to show the public the unvarnished reality of the investigation and the profound importance of every evidentiary detail. Justice, it would seem, is not merely about the closing of a jail cell door. It is about the emergence of truth. In retrospect, one is compelled to wonder if there were subtle warnings, faint signals of distress that went unnoticed by everyone. Could this tragedy have been averted if a single person had intervened sooner? It is a certainty that we may never possess all the answers, but what has been uncovered is enough to ensure that Nancy Guthrie and the life she lived will not be forgotten. One is left to contemplate whether the justice system truly provided solace for Nancy's family, and to confront the disquieting question of what lies hidden behind the faces of those we believe we know best. The unending search for answers in the wake of such darkness means more of these stories will continue to demand our attention. Gemini Danoi, the tragedy of Nancy Guthrie, is a haunting reminder that the most devastating storms don't always gather on the horizon. Sometimes, they brew right inside the sanctuary of our own homes. The betrayal by Tomaso Shion, a man embraced his family, shatters the illusion that we truly know those closest to us. It serves as a chilling testament to the fact that greed, resentment, and the weight of hidden secrets can transform a loved one into a stranger capable of the unthinkable. This story compels us to look deeper. It teaches us that justice is not just a verdict in a courtroom, it is the agonizing emergence of truth. We learn that our choices are permanent, and a single moment of unchecked fury can ripple through a community, leaving a void that no amount of time can fill. Let Nancy's legacy be a call to action. Cherish transparency over silence, and let empathy be your compass. We must look out for the subtle distress signals in those we love, and never take the safety of our circles for granted. In a world of masks, the greatest protection we have is the courage to speak the truth and the unwavering commitment to value human life above all else.